Well, it's very good to see you, Anne. And I think the first time we met, one of the people we had quite a bit of conversation about was one Ernest Hecht. Do you remember that?
I certainly do, because it was a glorious day. You were interviewing me for Stationers, and we had a lovely warm sunny day in the garden, and that's when I think it may have come up with you and Arsenal or something. I think it came up because, of course, as you well knew, Ernest was a fan to his dying day, and that was the point of contact for the two of us, because I'd known him for many years.
It was because I'd written you could write a page for an Arsenal programme, and I wrote one as a clergyman, and he was fascinated to find a clergyman had written this, and wrote to me and said he'd enjoyed the article. Why didn't I go and have champagne and lunch and watch a football match with him? Thereafter, I used to do it at least once or twice a year. A remarkable person, Ernest, wasn't he?
He was where he could be. Fortunately, I never had to work for him. Many people who worked for him would say otherwise, but because he and I were kind of social beings and met like you, I mean, we used to have lunch every couple of months. And much like you, he was a great letter writer when something tickled his fancy. So I think something appeared about me in the trade press, and he saw that I was a fellow independent publisher, and he penned me a letter and said, can we have lunch? And we did, and ever after we met regularly, and he did take me to a number of matches at the Emirates in the days when Blackburn Rovers were actually playing them, because it gave him great delight to be able to kind of imperiously rule over the fact that we usually got trashed when we were there.
Yes, I mean, the thing that, people may be interested, I think, because he ran Souvenir Press, which was the longest surviving independent publisher right the way through until he died. And of course, he'd come across on the Kinder transport out of Czechoslovakia, and happily his parents later escaped. And he went to Hull University, and not long after, really, started up the press. Great fellow.
He set it up in his back bedroom, and he called it Souvenir Press because his first idea for publishing was to do sort of commemorative books on football. And I mean, he was bad crazy. I mean, as I said, when he came over and when he was old enough, obviously he became an Arsenal supporter, and he was to his dying day. But he was really mad about football. He loved cricket as well. Was very proud of the fact that he published quite a few of Neville Cardus's books. And in fact, in his later illness, when he was in hospital, he was such a charmer. He got to know everybody, and he got to know every consultant, and found out which football teams they all supported. But there was one consultant who wasn't in football, but he discovered that he loved cricket. So Ernest gifted him a set of Neville Cardus's books.
Yes, I mean, and of course he told me that the very first Saturday he found himself in England after he escaped on the Kinder transport, he went to watch Arsenal and never stopped since. Anyway, we'll move on from Ernest. I mean, but yes, I think people would find him fascinating. You're basically from the south of the Thames, as I was joking with you earlier on. But then, were you at schools in the same part of the world?
Was I at school in the same part of the world?
Yeah.
Yes, I when I was originally went to school on Kingston Hill. My father was C of E, my mother was Irish Catholic, and of course in those days, in the 50s, if you were Catholic, it was insisted upon that children were brought up a Catholic. So I went to convents until I was 18. Taught by various orders of nuns. So originally in Kingston, and then when my parents moved, I went to a convent grammar school until I managed to flunk my A-levels miserably for a variety of reasons, pleaded with my father to let me retake, and I went to Guildford Tech to retake, and led a hermit's existence in that year because I was determined that I wasn't going to repeat my previous mistakes, and did absolutely fine, and then got myself a place at university.
And then you decided to flee southern England and go to Lancashire, to Lancaster.
Yes, I, as I mentioned to you, I wanted to get as far away from London as I could, because I felt that it would be good to go to a university where there was a dynamic of its own, which wasn't relying on London life or social life. And it was also a question of the combination of subjects that I wanted to do. Lancaster was a very interesting university at that time, still is, in that it offered combinations that other universities didn't really offer. You had to do 3 subjects in your first year, all of equal weight, which I think was a very wise decision, because they knew that a lot of people got up to university and discovered that what they wanted to read, they didn't want to read. But having done 3 subjects of equal weight, it meant you could transition in your second year without any problem at all. They also had this very interesting thing called a free 9th unit, which meant you could take any single subject on the university curriculum. I mean, if you were doing arts, you could do science if you wanted to, but there were a lot of courses that were especially geared to free 9th unit, and I did literature and revolution for my free 9th unit.
Mm. We went round Lancaster. Well, I've been round Lancaster a couple of times. When I first went round with a friend of mine who was there just before you, it was really very much still that modern set of buildings on that site, fairly contained. But when we went back about, I don't know, about 5 years ago now, it's expanded enormously, hasn't it?
Oh my goodness, when I was there, I went up in 72. There were 2,000 students. I mean, tiny by today's standards. And actually, you know, the fact was, with only 2,000 students, you sort of had the feeling that you could get to know everybody. I mean, it was wonderfully intimate. The other thing I loved about it, which was another important reason for me choosing it, was a collegiate university. So rather than belonging to your department, your affinity was obviously to your college, like, you know, Oxbridge. And I really enjoyed that, because obviously it meant that you came across, if you were in a city university reading a subject, you would go and you do your subject, and maybe you would meet other people from other disciplines. But obviously the great thing, because your college was your epicenter, you got to know people from every discipline, which was great. It was a great way to mix with people across other disciplines.
And you certainly used your main subject very well later on, didn't you? I mean, you read English, and you've been both a writer and a publisher. Which came first? And did you was the first thing you did was to write a book about cookery or about food, or? No,
that came much later. Publishing was first. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to teach, and in my last year at university, I was being hounded by the careers department, who was set on getting you in to find out what you wanted to do. And so I finally went in for a chat, and I said, I think I'm interested in the Arts Council. And they said, well, we don't know anything about that, but how about teaching? And I said, no, definitely don't want to teach. So with that, we sort of parted company. And on my way out of the department, I saw this leaflet on careers in publishing. So I picked up this leaflet, which basically said, publishing is almost impossible to get into, don't even think about it. And I wasn't quite sure what the purpose of this leaflet was, but anyway, this was tantalizing. So I thought, well, this sounds interesting, this sounds a challenge. And I found myself studying in my last year for my finals in a section of the library, which had this tiny little section on publishing. And there was the Stanley Unwin's book on understanding publishing, which I took out and read. And then I started looking in the bookseller every week to see if there were any jobs, and there weren't, because all the jobs that were advertised said you had to be experienced to get a job. And I thought, well, how do I do that? So when I came down from university, I just penned about 16 letters to various publishers asking for a job.
And where did you go, first of all?
Well, I was very fortunate in those days. I mean, it's obviously long before emails or anything else. So one actually did send a letter, and it shows how long ago it was, because we weren't even taught how to do a CV. I just sent a letter, and all these letters I sent out, I didn't even put a telephone number on it. I was fortunate that my letter landed at Faber when they were actually looking for a general factotum. And the person deputed to find me phoned up directory inquiries. And because Dolamore is such an unusual name, and we were the only ones in the telephone book, she managed to find me, and I was summoned up for an interview. But I had no idea to what department I was being summoned.
And when you were there, because was that after the days of TSN? He'd have gone by then.
He would have gone. He would have gone by then, but obviously the ghosts of all those august predecessors stalked the corridors. I actually got interviewed by Tony Pocock, who had been at OUP before going to Faber. And I've always said that the sole reason that I got my first job was because of cricket, because my CV read like The Sporting Life. And Tony said to me, I see you like cricket. And I said, I love cricket. I tried to get a women's team together at university, and failed miserably. So we talked about cricket for 2 hours, and I was offered the job. And I had no idea at that point, because nobody in my family or anything had anything to do with publishing, that publishing and cricket were joined at the hip.
Yes. Well, were the Faber family still involved then, or not really?
No, they weren't involved day to day. They were kind of non-execs, because of course it's always been an independent company. It still is. It's in the family, but we very rarely saw them, because Charles Monteith was chairman at that time, and Matthew Evans, who went on to be Lord Evans, was the managing director at that time. This was 76, 77.
And now the other thing that I picked up that I sounded really, what a wonderful title, The Essential Olive Oil Companion. Tell us about that.
Well, I was at Faber for a number of years. Then I went to Andre Deutsch when Andre was still there. Again, one of the great emigre publishers like George Weidenfeld and Ernest. Andre was great. I was their Central London rep for 2 years. And then I left and I set up my own business doing marketing and special sales, because these were the very early days. This was the beginning of the 80s, when publishers were really only finding their way into selling into areas outside of the book trade. And I set up as a consultant. And then I met John, who had set up Grub Street, who I didn't know anything about. I met him at an exhibition and suddenly told him that I had this idea that I wanted to write a book on olive oil. So he said, well, send us a proposal, which I did, and they turned it down. And so I then phoned up and said, no. They said they turned it down because they'd been offered a book on oils and vinegars, and they thought that just a book on olive oil was too specialist. So I hadn't been in sales all my life in publishing for no good reason. So I phoned up and I said, no, I'd like to come in and do a personal pitch to you on this, which I did, and they ended up taking on mine and rejecting the other one.
Marvellous. And then you got involved with a food programme, and also with the Mayor of London's project. Who was the Mayor of London at the time?
That was Ken Livingstone. That came about because I'd always been very keen on campaigning for food, and that people could learn to cook and other simple things. And I became a member of the Guild of Food Writers. And then I went onto the board of trustees of an organisation called Sustain, which is still going today, still very vibrant, which is campaigning umbrella organisation, an NGO. And I served as a trustee for 5 years on the board, and then I was asked to be chair. I took over from Tim Lang, Professor Tim Lang, who'd been Professor of Food Policy at City University. And those 10 years were fantastic. We were doing great campaigning stuff in all areas. They actually were the organisation who managed to get people not to feel embarrassed going to a restaurant and asking just for water. It was the days of only buying bottled water, and we led lots of campaigns. And we realised that London was one of the only capitals at that point that had no food policy. There was nothing within the remit of the capital to look after food. So we approached Ken Livingstone at that time and persuaded him to set up a London Food Board, which he did, and gave us a budget. And we started operating to look at food within the capital. It was a very vital, it's ongoing now, but those were the early days back 15 years ago.
So did you encounter Ken?
Occasionally, yes, from time to time.
Yes, and hopefully that was a better encounter than your husband had with
Robert Maxwell.
Robert Maxwell, yes.
Yes, having been made redundant by Maxwell, yeah, in fact, John's just finished reading the book that's been published called Fall by I've forgotten who it's Preston, isn't
I know. I've read the reviews, yes.
And he sat there chuckling, obviously quite a lot of things ringing true during that experience.
But your interest in food, as I gather, goes right back to your youth, because in the 60s, people like Robert Carrier and Elizabeth David and so on. And I suppose, have they now been taken to their fathers, as it were, or are they still around?
No, and in fact, one of the things I'm really proud of at Grub Street is that we publish a hardback edition of all of Elizabeth David's books. And you're right, I sort of cut my teeth, if you like, or maybe cut my mixing bowl with the likes of Jane Grigson and Elizabeth David. Jane Grigson at that time, I remember when I was a teenager, had a sort of part work in the Observer, which up until recently I still had. They were very crispy, crackly and much smeared. So I kind of grew up, those were the days too when there were very, very few photographs in cookery books. It was all text. And I think the fact was, the good writers had to be able to describe things to you, and the writing was all. A lot of writers can hide behind beautiful photographs now, but I was brought up on that, and I still love that kind of literary. And there are so many people, as we know, who say, oh, I love reading cookbooks. I read them like, read them like fiction, or read them like whatever. I read them in bed. So that's certainly what I grew up on.
And are these people around still, or have they now died?
Oh no, Elizabeth David died in the 80s. Robert Carrier, likewise, I think at about that time. Obviously, we've got new generation carrying the mantle today, but an awful lot of the successful writers today will say that they owe an awful lot to having been brought up on those
people.
Yes, yeah. And it was a bit like that for me with my essential olive oil companion, that I got the idea for the book, and it was very much storytelling, history, going back. I loved doing the research. In fact, many, I think, writers will recognize this. I spent so long doing the research because I was trying to avoid putting pen to paper or sitting down at my computer. In fact, it was a displacement. As long as I was researching, I wasn't writing, but I finally had to get down to it and do it. And it was very much in that kind of tradition of the way, I'm not saying my writing is anything like Elizabeth David or the rest of them, but it was that idea of setting food within a cultural context.
Well, when I was the Dean of Norwich, the person who I cooperated with most was, of course, the person who owned Norwich City. Exactly, yes. And she was a character, and she is a character, and was good to work with. And she's a Roman Catholic, of course. And we put on special service for the centenary of the club, and Delia gave a little address, which was like a sort of tiny sermon, and it was very good. Now, tell us what, as you said, I actually interviewed you when you were wanting to become a stationer. What was it that brought you towards stationers?
Well, it was, I belong to the Wickendy Word Society, and we've always had our lunches at stationers, which has been wonderful. And gosh, that's one of the things I really, really miss, going to stationers and having social events, and especially the Wickendy Word. And it was one of our summer lunches for the Wickendy Word that I met Christopher McCain, and we were just chatting. I hadn't met him before, and we were talking, and I was telling him about my publishing background, and he asked me if I had thought about becoming a stationer. And I said, I didn't even know you could. I didn't know anything about it. I mean, it was a building as far as I was concerned. I didn't know there was any more to it than that. And he said, well, I think you should think about it. And it was entirely down to Christopher that I decided it would be a great thing to do.
Well, I'm very pleased you did that, and I was very pleased to interview you because you've got great energy and lots of ideas. So I hope that in the future, when we do all open up properly again, we can look to you again for new ideas and new things for stations. I hope you're storing them up from this lockdown. Does that sound possible?
It does sound possible. I mean, one of the I think for all of us who are used to it, and obviously, well, you must feel it too. I mean, you're used to being out with congregations and people and everything, and obviously publishing is hugely sociable. I mean, our whole industry runs on food and wine, really. I mean, it's always been said that Frankfurt, because of course, Frankfurt is the annual book fair, which of course didn't happen last year, but I've been to 35 Frankfurt book fairs.
I've been to one.
And they always loved us in Frankfurt because of all the trade shows that happen in the Messe at Frankfurt. The publishing industry spent more on wining and dining than any other industry. And as I said, it is an incredibly convivial industry. Those of us who I mean, I've been in it over 40 years now, and many of the people I knew when I first came in are still good friends, and we see each other and we stay in contact. And it's, in many ways, even though it's now a global conglomerate industry publishing worldwide, and so many of the big publishers are owned by foreign publishers, it's still at its heart, it's very small and intimate, and we do know each other, and that network is pretty tight, which is what makes it, I think, a very special industry.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a rather good note for us to conclude on, with wining and dining and getting together. So we look forward, Anne, to doing that, I hope, in the not too distant future now, and we'll look out for each other and continue the conversation then.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Master.
Thank you.